Hello and welcome to the Security Collective podcast. I'm your host, Claire Pales, and today we welcome back Nick Ellsmore. Nick, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Your episode from season 1 remains number 2 of all time downloaded episodes, and so by popular demand, welcome back.
Thanks, Claire. I'm flattered and glad to be back again.
So when we met you back in season 1, we talked about how you'd built your career, you've built multiple security businesses, and we covered some of your opinions on the skills crisis, which you termed the security roles crisis, if people want to go back and have a listen. So has much changed in this space, do you think, since we last caught up? And are you seeing a shift in the cyber job market for better or worse?
It's a fascinating question. It's definitely changed. The interesting part for me about that question about whether it's changed for better or worse is for who? Like what lens we're looking at this. So I'll break it down into three different aspects. One is for me as a cybersecurity professional. The second is for me as a manager who's trying to hire a team and run a business. And the third is sort of for the economy overall. For me as a cybersecurity professional, I think it's fantastic. It's a hot market. I get approached every week with interesting job opportunities. Venture capitalists offer to fire hose money at me to start businesses. Like it's a great time to be alive. For me as a manager, it's pretty challenging. I still need the economics of the business to work. And that's, at times that's getting hard. I think the positive piece from the business side is it's really starting to force everyone's hand in terms of really investing in learning and development and graduate programs and interns and really building out the base of people in the industry. And then the last piece for the economy overall, I don't necessarily know that it's great there either, because the dynamic we have at the moment is, we have above average attrition, above average mobility between roles, a lot of people moving around. All the research says people are of below average effectiveness in the first few months in a new role. And so if you take it at a macro level that a above average number of people are in new roles, then you're effectively saying that a disproportionately large part of the cybersecurity industry is currently not functioning at 100%. And that can have a pretty significant impact. But key piece for me is it is really, really positive that it has driven graduate programs, intern programs, focus on learning and development, diversity, and all those other things to try and help solve the issue.
It's actually a really interesting point about productivity. This great resignation that everybody keeps talking to me about, and we've covered it in a number of episodes in this seasons of the podcast. It's a really interesting thing to consider that if 40% of people move on from their jobs in the next 12 months, the productivity and the effectiveness and the culture shift that's going to occur will be incredible.
It's enormous, and it's even more pronounced in the professional services firms. They're having the same issue in accounting, in auditing, in consulting, like all across professional services, this really high attrition. And it's absolutely a known fact that, if you bring a new person into a professional services organization, there's at least, at best case, it's 3 months, more likely it's going to be 6 months. In some cases, if they're, relatively early in their career, it could be 1 or 2 years before they're like really, really able to be self-reliant. They know all the processes, they know all the systems, and they can really just get out there. And so when you have, 30, 40% annual attrition, and you multiply that out across the economy, it's a massive, massive, massive impact.
If we take a step away from just the skills and the sort of employment community, I suppose, and look at cyber more generally, what do you think have been the biggest shifts in the cyber industry over the last 2 years or, 18 months to 2 years since we've had such a change in the way we operate?
So I think the first one, and, this is probably predictable, is around the supply chain. But I think the piece for me around the supply chain is, I think what we've seen in supply chain risk is the broad acceptance or the broad awareness of it as an issue. And it's taken like a decade. RSA and Lockheed happened literally a decade ago. And at the time, If you go back and read the articles, at the time, the articles were saying supply chain risk will never be the same again. This has made everyone aware of the risks around the supply chain. It's all changed. And then within, 12 to 24 months, we'd forgotten it all. And then when SolarWinds happened, everyone goes, oh, wow, I didn't know that was a thing. It's like, yeah, it was. 10 years ago, happened. But I think now it's so pervasive just in terms of everyone's awareness that it is just unquestionably, a big issue. The second big shift that I'd call out is really around the fact that everyone's realized cybersecurity is a really, really hot market. And it's a supply side constrained market. And it's one where ultimately, if you have capacity, you're probably going to be a viable business. A lot of buyers can't really tell the difference between cybersecurity services. It's probably not a popular message, but I have some real concerns about the quality of advice that a lot of organizations are receiving. But there's definitely that recognition that it's a hot market and a lot of people are pouring in. And then the third big shift is, I'll borrow a term that I think I stole from Ron Wakely, which was marketecture, which is the sort of the crossover between marketing and architecture. And it's a way of capturing this idea that it's no longer enough to be secure. You also now need to be seen to be secure. And so security has started becoming something that really needs to have a marketing department. You need to tell your digital trust story. You need to be able to communicate your values. You need to be able to really have an external facing security team. And more organizations are going to start to sort of build that out. But I think over the last couple of years, that's been one of the big trends.
It's interesting because I wrote a blog about that a while ago about whether or not organizations had a level of comfort talking about the controls they've got in place and, did building trust with customers equate to customer retention? And, I wonder if people are doing the sums around that as well in that trust relationship now, especially because a lot of people aren't going into stores or meeting people face-to-face to build that trust with consultants and the like. A lot of it is remote. So you wonder if that desire to inject marketing into how we do cybersecurity and how an organisation presents cybersecurity will catch on.
I find that the tech industry tends to front run a lot of these security trends. And it's interesting because I guess it used to be that banking and finance would sort of be the leaders in the way security was approached and that sort of thing. And to their credit, I think if you do go back, quite a few years, the banks were probably the first ones that had, pages on their website about, here's how you can help secure yourself. Now, at the time, it was go download some antivirus software and, good luck with that. Whereas now, there's whole pages and pages and pages and awareness campaigns and everything else. But if you look at the tech companies, you look at, trust.salesforce.com, trust.microsoft.com, trust.atlassian.com, the resources that are available, the amount of material and thought that's being put into how to explain their security philosophy and approach and really to enable security in their partners and their customers is really enormous. And I think going back to the supply chain risk piece, one of the things that I think needs to be looked at a lot more by organizations is if your suppliers are really that important to your business, why aren't you helping them? I don't just mean like sending them a questionnaire and saying, fill this out because your job is to be secure. Help them. Like genuinely help them. Why wouldn't you let them come into your awareness program? Why wouldn't you help share resources? If you have 1,000 suppliers and you want them all to have a good policy, write one for them. Hand it out. I think that concept of genuinely working with your supply chain on their overall security is something that needs to become a lot more prevalent.
There was an interesting conversation I had with Paul from NBN earlier this season. He's the first episode of the season, and we literally called the episode, Cyber Marketing 101. But the focus was much more on using marketing tools inside your organisation to market to your employee community and be using those sort of marketing tricks, I suppose, to get your employee community to really engage and understand why cybersecurity is so important, because, we all know that it only takes one person in whatever team to click on a link and it can take the whole place down. But, really using the same way that companies put ads on TV and billboards and, those types of things as a mechanism to get people involved. Really, we need to start leveraging that if we're going to be able to trust our employee community to not to do the wrong thing as well.
We did a security awareness campaign for one of the banks, would be a few years ago now, and we actually did it in partnership with a PR firm. And the exercise was basically, look, we need a slip, slop, slap message that we can just pound away on and try to get something that's going to cut through and be memorable and all those sorts of things. But even just, as you say, the tips, the techniques, the way that we get messages to stick. As a cybersecurity industry, it's not necessarily something that we're great at, but there are plenty of people out there who are great at it.
If we talk about messaging, you were quoted last year in an article saying that good cybersecurity is boring. I loved that. And I guess to give the audience context, you were actually referring to why bad stories of fear, uncertainty, and doubt are used to obtain funding around cyber, and how that seems to be one of the key ways that CISOs and security leaders, or those accountable for security, they have to pull that lever and use that stick in order to get budget. How do you think CISOs can get better at selling cyber hygiene as a good news story?
So firstly, I love the fact that we've finally all relented and we're now going with CISOs.
Oh.
Whereas, deep down, we really want to call them CISOs, but we just can't because the Americans have won. So CISOs, sure, let's do that. I'll start off with a slightly challenging sort of perspective on this, and then I'll come to a more acceptable sort of viewpoint. I believe that boards have to own a lot of that responsibility, and they currently don't. This is supposedly a top 3 risk on many boards, but how many cybersecurity experts do you see getting appointed to board vacancies? There's not very many. It's fine to say that CISOs need to get better at talking to boards, but boards also need to get much, much better at understanding what they're being told. The example that I give is, as a director, if you tried to say as a director, I'm not an accountant, so I can't be expected to understand the financials, you would get laughed out of the room, and you'd probably be prosecuted when something went wrong. Whereas we still have plenty of directors who would say, I can't be expected to understand IT. It's 2021, you can be expected to understand IT. If you don't understand it, either you need to get familiar enough with it to be able to deal with the information you're being told, or retire. So that's kind of my perspective on the board side. Now, that being said, I also understand that, there needs to be a more practical sort of set of advice for CISOs about how they can communicate. And I think I've got two pieces there. The first is, don't claim success for not having incidents. My point there is, if we acknowledge the fact that there are very, very few CISOs who are in anything like a position to spend as much as they would need to really be confident that they're not going to have an incident, then the last thing you want to do is try and present that you have somehow created the situation where you don't have an incident, where you haven't had an incident. So if a board ever, or your senior executives are ever saying, great job, you didn't have any incidents, take the time to say that your efforts are valuable but insufficient. It was good luck as much as good planning, because that's going to help you when you then do have an incident to sort of point back to say, look, I'm not taking the credit. I'm also, not going to take the blame. The second piece is, and this is where it comes to the boring piece, my key message around boredom is, so much of security needs to be about the basic controls. I mean, we're still talking about patching, we're still talking about multi-factor authentication, we're still talking about end-of-life technology, all those pieces. The piece about boredom for me is, one of the most powerful things you can do is focus on the completeness of coverage. What I mean by that is if you look at something like the Essential 8, like there's nothing in the Essential 8 that is exciting. And there's really not a huge amount in the Essential 8 that requires investment in sort of specific tech. It's ultimately process. And process is about completeness. If you have a patching regime, the question is not, do you have a patching regime? Yes or no. It's, okay, what proportion of systems are patched within whatever time frame you say they're going to be patched in? What proportion of systems are, subject to, they're able to be patched or they're end of life? If you have a endpoint security technology, what's the proportion of the fleet that it covers? Because when you start looking at that, what you find is in almost every case, you've got 95, 96, 97% coverage. And then there's these edge cases, which are systems that don't get connected very often, systems that belong to board members, and so they don't want MFA because that would, require them to learn a new thing. And so you start having these things that are basically, holes in the wall. And my view around the completeness of deployment, completeness of coverage is if you can invest in closing those gaps, then you at least know that the controls that you've decided were appropriate are now in place. And so now whatever happens is happening on the basis that it is something breaching the controls that you said were in place, rather than going around the controls that were in place.
So tell me then about shadow IT, because you can, or business-led IT, or whatever you want to call it, but you can put all the controls in place that you want, but then some person in a department buys a SaaS product on their corporate credit card or gets a free one and starts kind of putting information out there that might have PII or might be sensitive. Where do you go from that? And how do you educate the board about that? Because often directors and executives are the bad guys that are doing the shadow IT.
The question with shadow IT is, why is it necessary? The really, really simple premise that I always go back to, and I actually can't remember who told this gem to me early in my career, but you have to make the secure way the easy way. All of those cases where people are using shadow IT is they're trying to solve a problem that the business has not currently given them a way to solve. In almost every case that I've seen, they're not doing it out of malice. They're not doing it to try to be devious. They're not feeding information to the Russians. Like, it's just, they need to get this file from here to this other company, and it's too big to fit in, whatever technology the company has available. And the security team have locked down OneDrive, so they can't share files outside of their company. They can't use USB because USB drives have been locked down and it needs to get there tomorrow. Their business need is to get that file from here to there. If you don't give them a way to do that, they're going to find a way to do it. And that's where shadow IT comes in. The key piece for me is sort of having almost this concept of an amnesty and basically going, we understand we've done some things incorrectly in the past. We put security policies in place that result in the wrong outcome, in perverse behaviors. Just tell us what you're using. Tell us what you're doing. We'll find a way to solve it. But also when those things come forward, you can't then start, beating people with a stick and saying, well, there is no solution to that problem, so we're not going to solve it. Just stop doing it. No, that's trying to encourage people to pursue abstinence is probably not going to be successful.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you would like to think that most people, we assume good intent and that they are using those tools for productivity and to get things done. And so it's the $1 million question, how do we stop people from inadvertently creating the holes in our network that the bad guys can just step straight into?
Yeah, and again, I think, make the secure way the easy way, just focus on that. Understanding the business, and so understanding that these requirements exist and having a process for people to raise it. generally speaking, when people are doing this, it's because they've found a need. They need to solve it right now, and there's just not a process or a willingness. There's just not a way to enable it.
Nick, before I let you go, I'm really keen to know what your prediction is for 2022. What's the next big thing for the cyber industry next year and beyond?
That's a big question. So I think my perspective on this is we're currently having our moment in the sun. The cybersecurity industry, we spent so long trying to get people to listen to us and take the issue seriously. We're now getting that. Everyone listens. We're on the front page of the paper. There's money everywhere for new ideas, for employees, for everyone. It's just a great time to be in cybersecurity. I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is actually a bad thing to have to spend money on. The reason that we're doing this is not healthy. And from my perspective, being a consultant talking to our clients don't want to do this. No one gets up in the morning and says, wow, I can't wait to, put better locks on my doors. It's just not a thing. It's all of the industry outside of cybersecurity want this to go away. They want this to not be an issue anymore. And so I think we need to remember that, in a sense, our job is to create the entire redundancy of this sector. If we actually do our job well, then we all have to go and do something else because security is no longer an issue, which would be fantastic at a sort of, macroeconomic society kind of level. But my prediction for the next big thing is I think the industry will be forced to start standing behind a lot of the products and services that it's selling a lot more than we have in the past. And so that means things like, bulletproof service level agreements, means warranties, guarantees, sort of a pseudo insurance kind of self-insurance kind of model. And there are a couple of them that have started coming out, which is effectively organizations that are confident enough to say, if you come onto my platform, use this system, then, if you have an incident, we'll cover all the costs of responding to that incident. I think that type of concept where organizations are actually confident enough to say, if we can control your security environment, then we will basically indemnify you against any losses that come. I think that's what we're ultimately going to be headed towards, but there'll be a lot of baby steps towards getting there.
The cyber insurance industry seems to be trying to find its feet a little bit at the moment. And, many organisations are now saying, okay, we need to have this. But that feels like a financial tool. It doesn't feel like a strategy. It's certainly not a strategy. There are organisations that use it as a strategy. But my concern is that are organisations leaning too heavily on outsourcing that risk and that responsibility? And to your point, would they buy from an organisation or partner with an organisation that gave them that surety or that guarantee because they feel like they're giving the risk to somebody else?
Again, at a sort of big picture level, I think where this goes is, if you look at the slow progression, maybe it's not slow, of Microsoft and AWS and Google taking more and more of the security market, or more and more of the security around the pieces that they're already sort of providing and managing. I think it's only a kind of a small step from there to effectively say, well, if you're going to hand over sort of all of the control of the IT, how things are set up, how things are built, how things are run, and everything else, why would you possibly accept the responsibility for something going wrong? Why would that be your problem? And so I think, we will inevitably end up in a situation where, ultimately just, standard trade practices, law type concepts start to be enforced on this. We haven't for the last 30 or 40 years, but I'm still living the dream.
Legislation and then judiciary will catch up at some point.
Yeah, exactly. When I was at uni, my law professor had a poster on his wall that said, law moves at a pace second only to geology.
Yeah, you'd like to think there'd been change in that, but I don't think so. Nick, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming back. I'm sure we'll have you again, and I'm really grateful for your time today, as always.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks so much for joining me today. If you want more information on any of our guests, head to thesecuritycollective.com/podcast. This podcast is produced by East Coast Studio. I'm Claire Pales, and I look forward to seeing you next week.